Welcome to Critical Conversations again. And tonight, or this afternoon, I should say, or this morning, depending on what time zone you're in. That's the thing about the internet. We are potentially global, if, at least in possibility, if not in actu, as Aristotle would say. Um, but Roger is an old and dear friend of mine. He's got two PhDs from the University of Denver, including one from religious studies. And he's, until last year, he was the general editor of the New Polis, which is sponsoring these critical conversations. He's currently a senior lecturer in the Department of English at Metropolitan State University of Denver, and he's the author of a book, which we will be focusing on today, called A Transatlantic Political Theology of Psychedelic Aesthetics. Usually subtitles are longer than the title, but this is the reverse, and the subtitle is simply Enchanted Citizens. And his recent dissertation, which he did with me, is on, excuse me, it's entitled Ayahuasca in the Wake of a Doctrine of Discovery, talking about indigeneity, entheogens, and to a certain extent, the use and abuse of indigenous sovereignty in the global transmission of mind expanding substances. He's collaborated musically with Anne Waldman on a album called Untethered. He's also contributed to an edited collection by Miguel de la Torre, which a conversation about has been published on the New Polis, called The Colonial Compromise, The Threat of the Gospel to Indigenous Worldviews. Celebrate Tink Tinker's career in teaching. And he's currently co-authoring a book with Tink Tinker on the Euro-Christian worldview. So today he's going to be talking about psychedelic aesthetics and questions of how modern contemporary subjectivity has been transformed, reconfigured, undergirded, and so forth. So I'll let him talk, and I know he's got a lot to say. It's a fascinating book.
Thanks everyone for being here. There's a lot of people I know in the audience, and like we said earlier, a former teacher of mine, Rob Metcalf, who is important to sort of mention because he's the first person who opened me up to a lot of the philosophers that I talk about in the book. I have uploaded here in the chat a kind of guide for what I was going to talk about today. It's way longer than what I will get to say. If you scroll down to the bottom of the guide, there's a bunch of bullet points about psychedelic aesthetics are this, psychedelic aesthetics are this. And the book is not meant to be a comprehensive definition. So I say in the book that I use psychedelic aesthetics metonymically. So it's an open form that changes and is fluctuating all of the time, but at least that gives some grounding for people. And I'm approaching this beginning, I'll read about into page 3 up to where you'll see a Yoko Ono piece in what I uploaded. And then that'll take about 20 minutes, and then we can sort of break into other conversation. Like I said, or Carl said, I deal a lot with music. I deal with indigenous issues more recently in my work. And if you read this book, we can talk about issues of the book being unwieldy, because that's definitely something critics have said, and I agree with them for lots of really good, it's an astute observation, but I think the book is intentionally unwieldy as well, and I tend to like philosophy books that are that way. That's why I really like Walter Benjamin, and his Origins of German Tragic Drama is an unwieldy book if you've ever tried to read it. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to be unwieldy. So I'm gonna also, and I'm a teacher too, and I'm always concerned about accessibility issues. So I'm going to put up on the screen I'm just going to share what I've already shared with you so you can open it in your own documents as well. So let me share this, and can I move this over? Then I need to move your faces. Okay, so I'm just going to jump in. This is I thought that there might be a broad audience here, so we can get in deeper into the weeds with Herbert, Marcuse, or philosophers that come up. But I would just want to start, as if this is going on to the web for lots and lots of people with different backgrounds. So I talk about a liberal crisis, and so what crisis am I talking about? Or just what's going on in general, and why psychedelic aesthetics. So I think that we're going through a time where our faith, and I'm particularly talking to US citizens here, but we could extend that out. Our faith in democracy and democratic processes are being challenged. We feel angry and divided, anxious, suspicious, exhausted, and sometimes powerless. Our electoral processes are being directly challenged. In the US, this is a question of people's sovereignty, which that term sovereignty is a very loaded word or concept that's steeped in centuries of Euro-Christian political theological history. You'll notice that I lowercase in one word, Euro-Christian. That's a more recent part of my work. It does show up in the book I'm talking about today, but it's still capitalized and hyphenated there. So we're talking about a social movement, not a religion, when I talk about Euro-Christian. So due to what I and other scholars call a liberal or secularist Enlightenment narrative or myth, we often downplay the Euro-Christian theological ideas that have over the centuries amalgamated into how we think power naturally works. In the US, the idea of the people, or that the people are sovereign, was at one time an extremely radical idea. But of course, we know that when we look back at the revolution, for example, that even in the beginning, there was never this kind of one person direct electoral democracy, one vote, one person, nor did all the people who were living in the territory get a right to vote. It was privileged by a certain group. So what we mean by the demos in democracy, the people, is always in flux and in relationship to the myths that we tell ourselves about how governance works. Now, this word myth that I'm using is not myth in the sense of a lie, but the stories that we believe in and that shape our reality, or the narratives that we say about reality, the stories that convey a broader sense of meaning to groups of people. So it's not the individual story that I tell myself and my family background or something like that. It's something broader, and operating at the quasi-cultural level, although I might have some issues with the word culture. They are structuring stories. They're the stories that we tell each other to make sense of things. So in my book, I argue that attention to this thing called psychedelic aesthetics is going to help us address some of our current political myths. And the crises that we face with democracy right now, I would say, is that our myths about democracy are changing. At the same time, the two, most well-known political parties in the United States, in our kind of two-party system, the Democrats and Republicans, both have different mythological readings of the 1960s. So that's why I want to go back to the 60s a little bit. You'll notice that I use the word liberalism. When I use the term liberalism, I am including both Republicans and Democrats. I'm talking about a political economy where individuals have rights. So it's we think of people's there's something intrinsically valuable about the individual, and the individual possesses something called rights. Both Republicans and Democrats, or liberals and conservatives, they all agree on that very broad definition of liberalism. But in common speak, we often say traditional conservatives and liberals. So since the 60s, traditional conservatives see a moral decline since the 60s, and traditional liberals have characterize the 1960s as a kind of golden age era of civil rights that have more recently regressed with, we could look at the movement for Black Lives for like one example of the things like that, the narratives of progress that we might have thought that we had in terms of civil rights issues from the 60s and the women's movement and the American Indian movement, or the broader civil rights movement, that the progress on racial ideas in particular have not gone as far as we would like them to, and we see this kind of revanchism, a rise in overt white supremacy in the Trump years and the post-Trump years as well. So the narratives are shifting, I would say. These traditional narratives of liberal and conservative about the 60s and what they mean. So, for example, if we take January 6th of 2021 last year, the events were not hippies trying to levitate the Pentagon. They were activist right-wingers. Right-wingers now speak out against activist judges while placing their own and funding generations of lawyers. And this is something that they have done since the 60s very well. The right wing in our country has funded multiple generations now of a legal establishment that is challenging things like Roe v. Wade, and promoting what I would call sort of traditional or evangelical Christian values within legal systems. But at the same time, I would say that we are a Euro-Christian national entity as well, with a much broader history of entrenchment in Christian theology. And you can debate me on that in Q&A for sure. But on the other hand, we see people like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, who, and like many on the so-called liberal or the left side, embrace more and more a law and order type of politics. And that's a politics that Richard Nixon introduced just at the end of the 60s as he imposed the drug war and the drug scheduling onto various substances, including psychedelics. So liberals today want a return to normal. They are upset at the ways that our legal establishment is being challenged, right? So they're defending the establishment. So there's this kind of crisscrossing of traditional narratives. And so when we look back to the 60s and the ways people have sort of given sort of political narratives of that, that is causing some, or if it's not causing, it's at least evidencing some of the confusion that we have today, and therefore might be a way of at least explaining some of the unrest that we see in our broader public culture. So in the book, I call this the political theological vortex. Now, vortex is that place like the left and the right are no longer distinguishable from each other. They've blended into one thing and we don't know what's happening. This has been happening amid a 40-plus year shift, globally speaking, to the right. And there are some various books on that you can, talk. I'm not the only one to mark that shift, that we've shifted increasingly towards the right. Neoliberal Discourse does this as well, with like the Reagan era and Thatcher and this shifting over to the marketization of economy. And there's definitely an overlap in the way that I talk about psychedelic aesthetics and the conversations of neoliberalism. But I'm using this discourse of political theology. So this is my method in the book to address psychedelic aesthetics. It's a radically interdisciplinary and post-secular approach. We can talk more about what post-secularism means as well. I have a particular take on it, but I don't mean that liberalism and the liberal democracy is completely dead, and that there's just this influx of we're going back to the medieval era in terms of church belief and Christianity and things like that. That's not what I mean by post-secular. So why take? You might ask, like, why? We have this already convoluted discourse on neoliberalism. Why should we talk about something like psychedelic aesthetics that are in flux anyway and kind of hazy? And why take an aesthetic approach to discuss crises in liberalism? Wasn't it Walter Benjamin who called Aesthetics, Fascism, the Aestheticization of Politics to begin with, right? So so that should be, behind us in some of our thinking about social thinking and politics. And so here's the breakdown. This is for generally for the the person who doesn't read a lot of philosophy or theory or isn't an academic. So from 9/11 to the attack on the Capitol in 2021, the 21st century has been marked by an increasing number of states of emergency and states of exception. And scholars like me look back, and we've been doing this for a while, since 9/11 at least, but probably before that. We were looking at these challenges to democracy and looking back to the failed democracy of the Weimar Republic in Germany. So at the end of the First World War, liberal democracy was effectively imposed by the Allied forces onto the defeated Germany, with the demand that Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicate his throne. The result was a brief Deutsche Republic, or the Weimar Republic, from 1918 to 1933. We all know what happens in 1933, right? That's when Hitler comes into power and declares a state of emergency or state of exception in Germany that lasts until the end of World War II. So a state of emergency should be signaling scary fascist takeover. The Republic's first 5 years were in turmoil, and during a time in which the Social Democrats, who've recently come back into power into Germany, contended with critics of liberalism on both the left and the right. So during this period, the illiberal right-wing Catholic legal theorist Carl Schmitt wrote an influential book called Political Theology. He also wrote a book called The Dictator as well, but for this discussion, political theology is enough, because he famously defined the sovereign in his book, Political Theology, as the one who makes the decision in the state of exception. So Schmitt's main critique of liberal democracies and representative government, like the US, was that it has this tendency toward endless bureaucracy and the inability to make any definitive decisions. So when we think about the 21st century in the US, how often do we hear people complain about the inability of unending partisan stagnation resulting in the lack of ability to get anything done in Washington? Need to have a decider go in and drain the swamp, right? Because they can get something done. That's exactly what Schmitt is talking about in terms of his critique of liberal democracy. So we've been habituated in the US to instantly vilify fascism, which was brand new, as a political term at least, in the 1920s in Italy. And to blend that with totalitarianism, which they're not necessarily the same thing, but we are accustomed to like unthinkingly just say like fascism, totalitarianism, bad. And this is largely due to the results of the Second World War. And I'm not claiming that fascism or totalitarianism are good, but I'm just talking about the way we're habituated. So the commonplaces of language and values mean that few Americans take the time to really reflect on what these terms mean, just like they don't always take time to think about what they mean by freedom when they advocate for freedom. So we have come more and more to treat the U.S. In the U.S., presidents like pseudo-kings, longing for strong deciders who will clean up Washington or drain the swamp. And whether it be George W. Bush's move towards an international zero-sum politics defined by an axis of evil, and the implementation of the Patriot Act, or Barack Obama's cagey definitions of executive orders to use drone strikes without asking Congress for permission to go to war, because the drones aren't actual soldiers, he says, or Trump's entirely whimsical political maneuvering as a corporate and nationalistic boss man, the people in the United States have overwhelmingly displayed a rightward shift since at least the Reagan era, I would say the Nixon era, such that right-wingers now depict Joe Biden, a very regressive Democrat who models his foreign policy on the Kennedy Cold War era, as a kind of far left. And I think Biden is really important for this conversation because he wasn't obviously president when I wrote the book, but like, you know, he did, like, that idea of Camelot still had some resonance for his election campaign and for his foreign policy. But he's being characterized as far left. And then even our so-called liberal newspapers like the New York Times and Biden's constituency now constantly make the Schmidt resounding claim that Biden and his party are completely ineffective. Even with it, a majority of Democrats, we can't seem to get anything done in Washington. If you just look at the news media recently, this is constantly in the front pages of the newspapers. So my intention today isn't really to talk about like Joe Biden and the Democrats or whether or not they're getting anything done, but rather just to draw our attention to the broader cultural shift to the right since the 1960s, where people believe now that electing someone like Biden gives a kind of relief or a return to normalcy amid the most pronounced state of exception yet, the COVID-19 crisis. We could also talk about the environmental crisis as well, because that's a broad state of emergency that we will all have to face. And it's giving people a lot of, reason to question whether or not democracy, with the time that it takes to get anything done, whether or not that is going to get things done as we're working against this kind of apocalyptic clock of climate change. So the crisis in democracy that I want to refer to here is the crisis in the faith of democratic governance itself. And the most highly indicative evidence is our public longing for increasingly strong deciders. The desire for more autocratic forms of rule is expressed most noisily by those who claim that they are patriots while attacking the electoral process itself. At the opening of my book, I write that political theology names not just the relationship between religion and the public sphere or spheres, but the underlying faith that a democratic citizen or subject has in the political order and its laws. As Wendy Brown has brilliantly argued with respect to the saturation of neoliberalism in all sectors of our society, we're facing a loss of democratic values and an undoing of the demos itself. Democracy and capitalism have always been in tension with one another, and none of the early theorists of markets ever suggested that the inherent inequalities of markets ought to guide all aspects of social life. But that's what neoliberalism does, is it says that markets should define everything, right? So the undoing of the demos is the undoing of the everyday citizen's faith in democracy. Of course, constant gerrymandering, unstoppable filibuster, and unfounded challenges to the election results don't help matters either. So why, amid all of this, do I want to point us to this thing called psychedelic aesthetics? Isn't it hard enough already? Or just to wrestle with something like neoliberalism? Well, I want to take the term separately here. By psychedelic, I mean its literal definition, mind manifesting, as coined in a letter from Dr. Humphrey Osmond to Aldous Huxley in the late 50s as part of a market sloganeering game that Huxley was famous for from his 1931 book, Brave New World, where there's a lot of this sloganeering language going on that he's playing with in that book. They were intentionally redesignating substances previously defined as psychotomimetic or mimicking psychosis because Huxley believed that in the democratization of mystical experiences. But, of course, Aldous Huxley never intended the full-blown attempt to turn everyone on that would emerge within a decade of his death, most famously with Timothy Leary. And we can think about tune in, turn on, drop out, right? In the book, I claim that a European fantasy structure has manifested itself in the affluent society of the US of the 1960s that shaped the ways that we now today conceive of liberal democratic values. So if we're facing a crisis, we should look back to that moment when, as the newly dominant world power, the US intelligentsia drew on the intellectual thought of those who had fled Europe during the Second World War, oftentimes left-wing, oftentimes Jewish intellectuals. This concluded with a great expansion of access to the higher education in the US. So although the affluent society conditioned this, it is not exactly accurate to say that there was a cultural sea change that happened only among the so-called liberal elite. So one thing that I think that is easy to forget today is that there was a very big expansion of access to higher education and public education in the US in the 1950s and 60s, especially after the 60s, the creation of the NEA and the NEH, the National Endowments for Arts and Humanities. There's a lot of political theological reasons for that we can discuss. But that is something that we forget, is that the demos of people who had access to education did expand greatly during that time. And now we know, those of us in higher education, we know it's shrinking in some ways. Even among Latinx population, who have been traditionally in the past 10 to 20 years the most expanding demographic, has been shrinkage, and it's partly COVID, and there's other reasons why we could talk about that too. The youth of the affluent society that had little tangible experience with war or what war means, that their European teachers had faced, made it all very abstract for these to be a young college student in the 60s. And yet at the same time, if you just imagine that you were back there as a college student, you have this generation of people older who went through World War II, and there's this kind of heroism. They call them the Great Generation and all of that. So there's something to live up to. But it's all very abstract. So indeed, for many young soldiers, at least initially going to Vietnam, there was a sense of patriotic impulse driven by the World War II generation. So much of this patriotic imaginary became increasingly questioned in comparison to the broad-ranging liberation movements across the world. So while that's kind of happening in the US, you have, since the sort of explosion of the ability for Europe to economically control the rest of the world in World War II, you have in the 1950s all throughout the world the breakdown of colonial governments, starting with India, especially in 48, and then continuing throughout Africa in the 50s. We get the post-colonial theories that come out of that moment, right? So the social imaginary for Americans was largely virtual, though. So there's a lot of patriotism, and then there's also this kind of all of these things that are happening around the world, maybe not necessarily just in the United States. And it's in that movement towards the virtual era that everything becomes aestheticized. So that's why I want to say that it's an aesthetic focus that we need to have. We can't just talk about politics not being aestheticized. So this is not to claim that that there were not very real effects of the political conditions, but that one cannot understand the global unrest of something like 1968 without this virtual aestheticized component. So I've talked about psychedelic, and I'll talk about aesthetics here, and then there's a bunch of bullet points at the end of my document that you can look over for what I think these are, but I'll break for some discussion in just a minute here. So by aesthetics, the word traditionally means of the senses, and you get anesthetic when you go under for surgery, right? So at least since the European Enlightenment, there was a particular emphasis on a particular kind of sensibility. And we can think about Jane Austen books like Sense and Sensibility, the moral senses of the 19th century, that indicated a kind of internal refinement. And that internal refinement mapped onto a kind of Euro-Christian civilizing process. So if you read James Stuart Mill, like classic liberal thinkers, there is a kind of rationality, and they put it on this scale that I call the European imaginary, by which indigenous people are lesser people of color are lesser, and there's a question about how fast or how quickly they can assimilate themselves to become civilized in this kind of vertical, cultivated metaphor of what it takes to become a civilized Christian citizen. And the way that you showed that you were, civilized was to have this kind of rationalized sensibility that comes out of Enlightenment thought, especially. So Enlightenment thought, for me, even though the normal narrative is that it's a secularizing thing and it's pushing away from church and the Reformation, we could go back to that. I still characterize the European Enlightenment as inherently Euro-Christian. So in the 1960s, this sensibility became, above all, a moral sense acquired by reaching beyond the confines of the nation state. So here I say psychedelic aesthetics first expresses an expanded sense of worldview, often combined with ego death or loss, and then a re-entry into an established order with a kind of Gnosticism, a kind of knowledge that you've gotten from your tripping journey, that has given the individual a moral authority over the nation state. So people who are into psychedelics and really excited about psychedelics, they often do the first part, like, oh, I had my mind blown, or I went through ego loss. But we have to focus on re-entry. That is like, and it goes all the way back to the Psychedelic Experience Manual by Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert and those guys. But what I want to emphasize that is not discussed enough is what we mean by re-entry from a psychedelic experience. And what I'm saying is that the aesthetics portray a moral authority over the nation state. So you trip, you come back, and you have this authority to say, what the fuck is the US doing in Vietnam? So psychedelic aesthetics are at least initially boundary dissolving and fluctuating at a liminal level. And you might think of like a visual representation, and I purposely don't deal with visual culture much in the book because Alex Gray paintings are all over the place and Grateful Dead culture. But you might think, as one visual example here, the famous Fluxus piece from Yoko Ono, which was clouds on a TV set, because you have this mediatized TV showing up, but it's controlling nature and it's literally putting boundaries on something that would be expansive and perhaps ineffable. The movement of the aesthetics was to embrace the outside, to go beyond the TV screen here. And so to read this quote from Tom Wolfe's Electric Kool-Aid Acid Tests, he's referring to this book called Childhood's End, which I deal with in the book, the Clark book, a sci-fi book. And he's describing Ken Kesey's Merry Pranksters here. So Tom Wolfe says, the history of cinema gave the clue to their actions. First sound, then color, then stereoscopy, then cinerama, had made the old moving pictures more and more like reality itself. Where was the end of the story? Surely the final stage would be reached when the audience forgot that it was an audience and became part of the action. To achieve this would involve this stimulation of all of the senses, and perhaps hypnosis as well. When the goal was attained, there would be an enrichment of human experience. A man could become, for a while at least, and we might say they could become, for a while at least, any other person, and could take part in any conceivable adventure, real or imaginary. If you scroll down in my document, there's a lot more, and I'm just talking about my process of writing the book and trying to be very transparent with my audience here today. But I have a lot of bullets about what are psychedelic aesthetics, and what does tripping mean. But I'm going to pause there for questions or for Carl talk. Of course, Carl was there at Berkeley in the 60s, so I'm always, when I have to talk to the older generation, I'm always like kind of humbled because, it's the joke about Vietnam, right? How many Vietnam veterans does it take to screw in a light bulb? You don't know because you weren't there, man.
Hey, Roger, could you, before I interrupt here, could you kind of explain what psychedelic aesthetics is? Because I think it's be very important.
Yeah, let me just, so I walked through, in preparing for this talk, I just walked through Like I don't give specific definitions for it in the book, but I was just cutting and pasting from the book, so the page numbers are literally from my book here. But I'll just read a few of the bullet points here. So psychedelic aesthetics extend versions of romanticism and fuse it with the civil privileges of the liberal economies that triumphed after World War II. In the process, psychedelic aesthetics reimagine the boundaries of liberal subjectivity, not liberal democratic, right? Like the liberalism, like rights-bearing individuals, through consciousness expansion and then a return from that expansion, enchanting the individual with a Gnostic transcendence of nation-state authority. This becomes widely known as the trip. I use the term psychedelic aesthetics as a singular collection of a variety of different senses. This is partly because the artistic works that evidence such aesthetics tend to have synesthetic qualities. Because of this, my intention is to point to a version of aesthetics that pushes the meaning beyond the concept of the senses in order to account for the philosophical turns the thinkers I discuss import to the United States. Now, what that means is that most of the philosophers that are coming to the United States, they're reacting to this philosopher named Martin Heidegger, who was a teacher for many of them, especially for Herbert Marcuse, who's dealt with a lot in the book. And we can think of like Martin Heidegger as the kind of philosophical counterpoint to Carl Schmitt. They both became unapologetic Nazis, although people wanted to defend Heidegger for longer, although it is now clearly established, if you read the Black Notebooks, that he was an anti-Semite and a Nazi. And so a lot of the thinkers that I deal with, the Jewish thinkers that come to the U.S., Hannah Arendt being a lover of Martin Heidegger, but also being Jewish, are wrestling with the most powerful philosopher of the moment and the way that his philosophies kind of had this affinity with the fascist movement in Germany, or with totalitarianism, with the speeding things up, with feeling everything in one particular, in a very emotional moment. So this is like part of German fascism in the 1920s, late 20s and 30s, was very much a patriotic feeling of the Volk, we might say, but a sense that they're getting their country back, that was demolished in World War I, and they've all been shamed so much, and that they need to take back their pride, and in doing so they can embrace the Führer who's going to lead them in that particular direction. So it's high. That's what Walter Benjamin, I think, meant by the aestheticization of politics, was that kind of casting off of reason for the embrace of an emotional affective feeling. I'll read a couple more here, and then we can move on. Tripping during the war on drugs became a kind of ritualized code for many Americans to assert their own agency against the state law. Yet it is quite clear that some groups have had more privilege to explore spiritual transcendence, de-alienation, or other benefits espoused by psychedelic enthusiasts. The entrance of law and order rhetoric and the need to justify the deregulation of psychedelics for research meant that the psychedelic community diverged from the association with public activism and became more secretive and more, I would say, just more so Gnostic. Associating psychedelics today with the 1960s, whether it's the familiar conservative narrative of decline or the progressive moment of utopia, is not accurate without considering this important divergence of agendas in these worldviews. So if you were young in the 60s, LSD doesn't become illegal till 66. The drug scheduling doesn't happen till the 1970s. But that becomes, especially for people like me growing up in the 1990s as a teenager, people did pot or did drugs, and it was something that you did that was supposed to be transgressive. It was kind of like a rite of passage. Whereas I think for teenagers today who are growing up where marijuana is legal, in the psychedelic world we call marijuana the lesser sacrament, by the way. that there is not that sense. There's like, oh, I got addicted to marijuana. Like my first year students, like they're writing their papers and they're like, oh yeah, I went through, kind of got into some marijuana in my bad years in high school, but now I'm getting back on track in college. That's not the same kind of ritual transgression, and to a broader civic mindedness that was going on earlier. And for people, I'm maybe I'm the end of Generation X for me. One more, and then I'll pause. In the critique manifested by psychedelic aesthetics, the returned subject becomes a psychedelically enchanted citizen. Psychedelic citizenship offers liberalism political advice in situations of crisis through an experiential process. Psychedelic aesthetics articulate this by performing a public sacrifice on the state as a transcendent entity, and then disseminating social responsibility to the individuals. This sacrifice is similar to ancient practices of ritual sacrifice that involved the ingesting of the divine, and because for many psychedelic enthusiasts, a return to the pre-political or state of nature offered by an imaginary escape from alienation of modern subjectivity arises. So there's this kind of lore in psychedelics that if I take a psychedelic, it will tap me into the archaic revival, like Terence McKenna says, or Mircea Eliade, who's a fascist himself. That it will bring about this kind of, return to Burning Man type of gift economy or something like that, and it's going to allow us to tap into primordial shamanism before religion. All of that stuff is part of the archaic revival, and it's very, very right wing politically speaking, and I think that that's lost, especially on people who really are really excited about something like Burning Man. So there's a public sacrifice of the nation state going on, and that psychedelic aesthetics must unpack the desires of a deeply entrenched social imaginary wrapped up in the idea of sacrifice itself. So in a way, we might think of psychedelic aesthetics as performing a kind of secular Eucharist for democratic liberalism. And the Christian framing of such a ceremony is part of the dominant political theological tradition of the West. So we might think, so one of the differences, and Carl and I have talked about this before, one of the differences I would say between 2022 and 1968 is in 1968 you can have a movement like to levitate the Pentagon, and I had these pictures up here. The ones on the left are from the protest at the Pentagon, where people were surrounding and they were going to enchant and levitate the Pentagon. That was the performance of the psychedelic aesthetics. And then on the right here, the rightward shift here, you see images from last year in 2021 at the Capitol, where Jesus and Trump are conflated with each other. Jesus 2020, there's an overt revanchism of white supremacy and especially evangelical Christianity. So amidst this thing that I call the political theological vortex, is like, what the hell is happening? Like, if you're many I know many Christians who don't believe that this is what they think Christianity ought to be. Like, how can you be a Christian and be for Trump? But even Midwestern Christians that I know, and yet this is part of the discourse that we have today. So does that get at some of your questions there, Carl?
Yes, very much so. Thank you. If you could take it off screen share just for a second. So,
Yeah.
All right. So I want to throw open a very broad question, just to kind of pursue what you're saying, which I think is fascinating in a number of ways. But I want to actually challenge you, Roger, to go a little deeper than you've done here. First of all, just talking about the political theological, I myself am becoming very impatient with the way and with the whole variety of manners in which we use the term right wing and left wing, which I think, as you yourself have pointed out, Tom, they become in some ways inconsequential markers to what we're really talking about. What we're really talking about is the process of subjective identification, and subjective identification can be found in the historically, and this is a deep political theological issue, can be found historically in the evolution of the idea of the citizen, which literally means a member of the civitas, or it's related to the Greek word politeia, which we're talking about, kind of political consciousness, political reality. And of course, that's what political theology is all about, is to say what is the substance, what is the essence of this kind of unique political theology. The distinction that Aristotle made between the bios and zoe, which bare life and human life, I guess you'd say. Political life, which somebody like Agamben takes up and uses it as a kind of form of methodological leverage for dealing with a whole set of different issues. And in his later work, he also looks at the Christian iteration of this. And of course, I'm very much influenced by the thinking of Etienne Balibar and his notion of the citizen subject, because the citizen is a particular kind of reconfigurating transformation, kind of a renewed self-identification of the subject. The question of subjectivity, I think, is very closely allied with citizenship. In many respects, whatever we mean. I'm not just talking about in the kind of hackneyed political way, but citizenship in its original kind of etymological connotations. And so when you're talking about an enchanted citizens, in some ways that's a kind of redundancy, because there is a kind of enchantment in the very notion of citizenship. There was in the ancient Greek world. And if you look at the way, say, a figure like Augustine redefines what it means to be a citizen, that is, a member of the city of God. And of course, Luther talks about two kingdoms, and he talks about citizenship, and that becomes the kind of inflection point for the emergence of the kind of Protestant worldview that underlies and so sanctifies so much of what we call secular modernism. But the question is, at what point, and what is the structure of this sanctification that takes place? Well, let's not talk about the ancient world. Let's talk about the 20th century, which is where there are huge shifts. I mean, we start with the French Revolution, with the emergence of the kind of mystical notion of the citizen or citoyen, okay, which becomes a kind of Enlightenment idea that you can find particularly in the writings of Rousseau, the social contract. But essentially, citizen and bourgeois become really sort of synonyms, or at least homonyms, throughout 19th century thought. And of course, Marx, in his criticism of Hegel, his critique of political economy, tries to say, well, no, there's a whole excluded mass of people who, in a sense, deserve citizenship. That is, they need to be sanctified or subjects, and that's the proletariat. Now, it's kind of interesting today that the proletariat is seen almost as, by those who claim citizenship, the real proletariat, those who actually work for a living. And I think you can see what's going on in Canada with the truckers convoy and so forth, that these are like the wretched of the earth. These are they're called fascists. Fascist is a term now to describe anybody who's basically not a citizen, just like it used to be communist, depending which kind you kind of look at it in that particular way. But what happened in the 60s, and you mentioned education, the whole idea of the bourgeois citizen, that is one who lives in a city. That's what bourgeois means, or Bürger in German. One who lives in a city, one who is, in a sense, is involved in commerce or business. That particular, they become a class who appear in the early Middle Ages, but by the 17th and 18th century, they become, if not the dominant class, the most important class for their control of the financial economy, which monarchies were trying to harness but failed to do. And that's why you have the French revolution in many respects. So the question of enchantment, what happens with psychedelics is all of a sudden there is this realization that the burgher, or the one who lives in the city, who is classically identified with the nation state, is no longer is identified with the nation state, because the nation state is the locus of oppression. It makes the laws. It tells me, that I have to do this, I have to do this, I have to fight for my country, and of course, Vietnam was kind of the crucible of that, because, everybody of my generation realized that this was not only just, a unjust war. So many of us started out, with the whole kind of Cold War rhetoric buried in our head. It's kind of interesting that when I was in like 20 years old, my father, who was a veteran of World War II, who was actually a naval commander, was the one who was most opposed to the Vietnam War, because he had seen what was really going on there from the inside. And it took me probably till I graduated from college to realize that the patriotic narrative was in many ways a sham that didn't correspond. So we see the explosion of nationalism and the use of mind expansion, mind manifestation, whatever terms you want to, the identification with groups who had been considered outliers, like indigenous people. Remember, it was the 60s was also the time when the process of trying to assimilate indigenous people came to an end. And there first was an intention, well, hey, maybe we really screwed over these people, and we have to start considering their claims. But there were many indigenous leaders of the times who wouldn't even allow themselves to think that way, because they thought their era was over. And I would say, speaking as a member of that generation, it was in some ways the effort to try to identify with something that is not only larger than, but is deeper than the bourgeois nation state that led to the kind of fascination with, quote, Indians. I mean, you look at the hippies, they were always wearing beads and so forth. They were trying to, in a sense, create a kind of faux indigenous identity. And that was part of the expansion of the process. So what you have is this beginning of a new notion of citizenship, which later comes to play within 15 years or so with this kind of nebulous idea of the global citizen, whatever that means. And that becomes, in many ways, the kind of grist for the neoliberal view, which is what I call the progressive neoliberal, because I think we've got this tension. Neoliberalism is basically, you look at markets, but the question is, does your fetishism of markets lead you and somehow to identify with the old bourgeoisie, or identify with what you consider to be the new global multitudes, like in Hart and Negri? It's the kind of aestheticization of that also becomes the basis for the kind of corporatization of the world, the creation of global capitalism and cognitive capitalism and virtual capitalism, which, of course, in my book, which you've read, is what I really mean by neoliberalism. So in many ways, the question is, what are we enchanted about? And that really determines our politics right now. What's happening now is that particular enchantment, just like the enchantment of the bourgeoisie, is up against the fact that much of the world, which isn't educated and can't afford education, is increasingly being shut out, is becoming hostile to that enchantment. Usually these are working people, which at the end of the COVID, we realized, hey, we've got political power to, just like we did in the 50s with labor unions and so forth. The Great Resignation, it's called. It's a very interesting article in the New York Times this morning, in fact, comparing this to what happened in the 15th century with the rise of the bourgeoisie because of the demolition of feudalism brought about by the Black Plague. I would urge everybody to read it. I don't remember the author of it. Well, yeah, but anyway, it's worth studying.
Yeah. Let me address these two notions of enchantment, because I think that I can do it kind of economically. I do have to go back to the Greek, and one of the reasons why we have to go back to that is because in the psychedelic movement and people who are excited about psychedelics, they often refer back to the Kukion, to the Eleusinian mysteries and things like this, and we can talk about that sort of stuff. But let me just take a mythological example here. Medea is an enchanted woman. She either falls in love, or Aphrodite makes her fall in love with Jason the Argonaut, right? She's the eastern border, the edge of the Black Sea, and they overthrow her father, and then they go on this, trek throughout the Mediterranean. And at the end, Jason is supposed to marry Medea. Instead, what does he do? He's like, no, I'm going to marry somebody else. So he fucks over Medea. It's part of my language. But, and Medea, the witch who has saved her enchanting powers have saved the Argonauts time and time again, just gets cast aside, and she of course murders her children as a kind of revenge. The kind of enchantment that Medea has is the kind of enchantment that is not allowed in the polis. And so that is a different sort of thing, and I think we can think about that all the way through Federici and Caliban and the Witch and things and women's movements, and my friend Anne Waldman being a great articulator of this in her own psychedelic poetry. That the other enchantment that you're talking about is the enchantment of the polis, right? That is what Agamben is talking about when he talks about glory and glorification and the aesthetics of glory, and how that keeps a state going and transfers over the death of the king's two bodies in Kantorowicz, right? The idea that the king is dead, long live the king. That thing that keeps the nation state together, that Shakespeare is so obsessed with in his plays and tragedies, that we as a citizenry in the United States today are still obsessed with. Can it hold? Can it hold from the transfer of power? That is a different kind of enchantment. But I would say that the proletarian, in Marx's view, is already enchanted by the state. So what I mean by that, to take an indigenous example, is the Shining Path, a Marxist movement in Latin America. The Shining Path, like many Marxist movements, tried to claim a kind of Indianismo, and in some cases it works, in some cases it doesn't. But the Shining Path was a leftist movement that was paramilitary, and that was perfectly capable of wiping out indigenous peoples while claiming indigeneity, right? There was a sense for indigenous people that to become a citizen was at least a step up from being an Indian. Yeah. At that particular moment in history. The US and Nicaragua went in and tried to use the indigenous people on the west side against the Sandinistas in the 1980s, right? So indigenous life, I would not qualify as enchanted in the sense of Medea, especially indigenous life on Turtle Island. And yet I would say that there are these two kinds of enchantment, that there's the Medea kind of enchantment, and you could say that she's superimposed with La Llorona in Chicano culture, or some versions of Latinx culture, but she's a special character. She's different in Latin America than she is in Mexico and the borderlands. But there is, some people might say that Medea is part of that sort of thing. But enchantment is that I'm talking about in terms of the psychedelic aesthetics is definitely a kind of Gnostic enchantment that comes from the Greek worldview, or I would call it Euro-Christian worldview these days, which is that tendency towards abstraction. The proletarian is a citizen who's already been alienated from a state of nature, right? What happens in Aristotle, in the Politics, when he's describing what a slave is or a barbarian or who has slave mentality, are the people who don't fit into the polis. They're not enchanted in the sense of glory, Agamemnon's glory. They're not enchanted in the sense that they get a right to vote. That becomes internalized in the 15th century as the Europeans are trying to figure out what the heck to do with these new continents and all of these people that exist. And there's these debates about, are the Indians humans, and all, and this is partly why my current research is in the early modern era, right? Because there is this sense that the land has all of these resources to offer, and that the land is kind of enchanted in a way. If we could just get rid of the Indians and take all of their enchanted land, and then, you know, spiritualize the Indian in a particular sort of way through the noble savage trope or something like that. And that is exactly what the psychedelic folks in the 60s do, is they deterritorialize. It's already aesthetic, it's already virtual. They deterritorialize a sense of the land and reclaim it, right? And the birds do it. We could talk about music. It happens all over. Harold King's Going Back, the Birds, the Woodstock, the song by Joni Mitchell, Get Back by the Beatles, all of this kind of nostalgia. Nostalgia is homesickness. That's what it means. But it's like a homesickness for what? You're generally a liberal, affluent, white culture who is nostalgic for some sort of sense of the land that they want to claim in a new way. So it's deterritorialized, and then in Deleuzian terms, re-territorialized.
Yeah. And I would say one thing, and I think we need to let people in. By the way, if you want to ask a question right now, please put your question in the chat. It doesn't have to be an elaborate question, just a simple question, so I know to call on you. You know, otherwise Roger and I will just go on chatting here, but I'd like to bring other people into the conversations. I can't see everybody's hands, so if you just put in the chat you want to ask a question, that's fine.
There's a small group too, you can also chime in.
Yeah. Or chime in, yeah. Sometimes the Zoom kind of intimidates people. I don't know why. You just say any questions. But I want to get back to this question of enchantment and the polis, because in some ways the history of, quote, Western civilization, I think, is the history of this expanding of the terrain of enchantment. In other words, it's a gradual deterritorialization and re-territorialization, used Deleuzian terminology, through the original kind of Greek, idea of bios. You look at the first attempt to do this, which is almost a kind of mystical idea, and it becomes a kind of paradox, because the reality of Roman brutality and its maintenance of the imperium, and it's also its idealism that it's bringing civilization. I mean, the first civilizing mission was the Roman Empire. There's no doubt about that. But this is this idea of the cosmopolitan, which literally means belonging to a universal or to a world cosmos. And cosmopolitanism has always been a tendency of, education and political abstraction. I mean, it's not just a modern phenomenon. You find it in the Enlightenment. You find it in the 16th century with the Renaissance. Whenever there is a kind of upsurge of new thinking and a kind of appreciation of the past, there's always this idea that somehow we have a new kind of domain whereby we can incorporate people who were outside that, but incorporate them on our terms. This is a point Mignolo makes in his Walter Mignolo in his books, first on the Renaissance, what he calls the darker side of the Renaissance, and later the darker side of modernity. In other words, cosmopolitanism is always kind of the way in which this enchantment of the subject, which starts out with the kind of an experience of otherness, now becomes bounded, becomes territorialized, becomes brought in to be ours. Boundaries are put about it in terms of abstract notions and so forth. I mean, even with colonialism, well, yes, we're not just, raping and pillaging anymore like conquerors did in the past. We're civilizing, we're educating, we're bringing these childlike people, into, into our sphere so they can, be truly human, which was an idea that goes all the way back to the Greeks in a lot of respects. So I'm saying, is enchanted citizenship. I mean, we see with the 60s, I think the first development of the transition from the national bourgeois citizen to the global citizen. And I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm confirming you, but I think it's not complicated. It was like we are citizens of something much larger, even outer space. That's when Star Trek becomes popular. You start getting, the beginning of Trekkie culture, and you get the kind of imaginary people like, Elon Musk, or in Jeff Bezos. Well, if we're going to be a true empire, it's going to be, a democratic galactic empire, and so forth.
Well, so there's a few questions. Like it seems like Adam has a question, and then there's Rob Metcalf has a question. Jonathan has a question. So why don't I start? I'll read out Adam, unless you want to read yours out, Adam, because it's being recorded and the chat doesn't show up online afterwards.
I can read it.
Sure, thank you.
Space. Really enjoying this conversation too. I would love to hear more from you, Carl and Roger, bringing militant love and citizenship into conversation. History is important, to be sure. I know, Carl, you've really driven this point home, and I really appreciate that, because in my time in graduate school, you helped me realize that. But at the same time, I'm interested in each of your thoughts moving forward. So my question is kind of a series of questions. What structures of sanctification are emerging in post-secular United States, hearkening to what you just said, Carl? And likewise, if at all, and what role do we have as scholars of religion during this time of liberal crises, if at all? And Carl, your point about what are we enchanted about, I think is very resonant. And I can't help but to wonder if there's this threshold in my own speculation of the rational into non-rational. Can it be articulated without being reinscribed in people's assumptions about what they're hearing already?
Well, since this is kind of Roger's platform, I wanted to kind of defer to Roger, let him answer the question. I've done enough talking. I think.
So I'm going to go with how I interpret this question. So when I hear a term like militant or militant love, I'm thinking of people like Alain Badiou, or the Christian notion of agape, which Herbert Marcuse deals with in his essays and books from the period, particularly Eros and Civilization. That the problem with Freud, according to Marcuse, was that Freud relegates the pleasure principle to the reality principle. Basically, that hi Sunny, that there is the child growing up has to have someone say no to them, and that no becomes the repressive superego, and you can't have candy for dinner, right? And that becomes the kind of moral authority. That's the reality principle over the pleasure principle. And Marcuse says that what the problem was with Freud was that Freud says that relegates pleasure, and a particularly aesthetic pleasure, the pleasure of the senses, to the child, and says that the adult doesn't necessarily have this. But what Marcuse says is, no, this is happening in the psyche before the psyche comes to fruition as a particular personality. And that is what he means by eros, and that we need to embrace an aesthetics that attaches itself to the unconscious. Now, what happens with neoliberalism or something like that is what Marcuse calls repressive tolerance or repressive desublimation. So what that means is that it basically, like in kind of crass terms, neoliberalism tries to take the entire unconscious and make it conscious. All of our desires are on display through cameras, through our cookies feeds, through like the camera, the little green dot that I'm looking at right now. Like all of it is on display in an unending public virtuosity or virtuality, sorry, of post-humanism, something like that. And so, what is love in that particular era? Well, if you're going with the ideologized love of Christianity, of agape, this is the love that can consume anything. This is the Oprah love. If we just put a let's just get a right winger and a left winger together and like they'll hug it out, something like that kind of idea. And I'm very sympathetic to my friend and Levinas scholar Sarah Pessin on this, and Levinas himself, that no, we want to push back against that kind of idea of a militant love that would say oh yeah, well you're just Jewish, but you're really just like me. We're all the same underneath, that kind of thing, that which imposes a Euro-Christian dominant reality or worldview onto other people and makes of other people only subject identities that can be remixed within the matrix of the colonized worldview, or what Marcuse calls one-dimensionality. And so what we're dealing with now is whether or not, or to what sort of possibility there might be to not be in the Euro-Christian agape Pac-Man, to use Sarah Pessin's term, Pac-Man reality, and to think about any kind of notion of real difference. And what I mean by real difference there is Deleuze, when he's talking about difference versus repetition, that difference in the unconscious type of level, and an idea of the unconscious that is not the subconscious right-wing mythology of Carl Jung, and not necessarily the infantilized unconscious of Freud.
Great. Thanks, Roger. Rob Metcalf, you said question.
Yes, thank you guys. And I really been enjoying this conversation. Since Aristotle's Politics has come up a few times, I thought I was thinking of a passage. This is book 1, chapter 2 in the Politics, where Aristotle is arguing that what makes the human being more politikon than any other animal is the fact that we have logos, and logos is what sets forth or makes manifest Delun, the just and the unjust, the advantageous and the disadvantageous, and so on. And I was thinking of this passage and wondering about this initial problem that you raised, Roger, in terms of political myths, and the problem that we have today with our various political myths, because the mythic and myth seems to lie on the border of discourse, of logos, but also something like what you're calling enchantment.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was wondering about your thoughts about this, about the relationship between myth and discourse more generally, logos, and how this relates to what you are discussing in terms of psychedelic aesthetics.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm a rhetorical theorist these days by training, and there's a long history of sort of tension between rhetoric and philosophy in the Western tradition. If we think about Aristotle and the political citizen, the bios, qualified life versus bare life, that logos is the thing, right, that gets some sort of almost quasi-mystical communicability, the ability to communicate. The barbarian is the quintessentially the one who you can't communicate with, that they are outside of the polis. I think that what we are dealing with in terms of like, I mean, this is such crazy just to like jump to the 21st century from this example, is to the issue on indigeneity that Carl had brought up, that what we have is not just different sort of mythic structures. We could theorize what myth is, but but if we take indigenous people from South America, for example, and just for, it's crass to do this, and I know he's a Euro-Christian scholar, but Eduardo Vivero de Castro, anthropologist who has this idea of Amerindian perspectivism, or what my friend Tink Tinker and Barbara Mann, who's a Seneca scholar, they talk about twinship models that cross the continents here, that are really, we have twins in the ancient Greek and Roman traditions. We have twinning going on, but there's something going on with four directions in twinning that's deeper beneath. It's a worldview that is beneath the individualized cultures, Cheyenne, Arapaho, or Incan in South America, for example, or Mayan, and in that worldview, there seems to be, a different kind of logos. Maybe is logos worldview, is a question we could ask. But one of the main differences that's very, very clear is that logos, if we were to translate that term, I guess, into an Amerindian worldview, it's clearly an interspecies communication that is happening, and by interspecies, we're not just talking animals, we're talking plants and rocks, and the cosmos. And I think that what is happening in Aristotle, and maybe you could give a more nuanced read on it, Rob, but in the Western tradition, that has been entirely translated into humanistic capacity. And I don't mean that humanism in the Renaissance sense of humanism, but it does seem to be that it's about the people who are fully people, who get to be the political citizens. Does that get at your question? I don't know.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated by the connections that you're drawing here. I guess my question had more to do with talking about the relationship between enchantment, or the archaic revival that you were discussing, and discourse, because we are in the midst of great confusion about what we even mean by freedom and other things that are part of our political myth making. But how does the transformation of political discourse and the unclarity about political myths, how does that relate to issues of enchantment and the archaic revival? I guess that was the direction of my question.
Okay. I think that people so first of all, it's in my thinking anyway, there's the political theological vortex. So there's a collapse of right and left, and so there's a mishmash of those mythological narratives. And in that, some people who are interested in psychedelics especially, have said that by ingesting this kind of substance, an entheogen, that we can somehow tap into the archaic revival. We can return to a state of nature, to a pre-political sensibility, and basically press a reset button and then start again from there. Liberal culture does this as well, has a reset button impulse. I mean, the French and American revolutions do this. The French Revolution imposes a new calendar of time, right? And so that impulse towards the perennial, I'm highly suspicious of. And I think that that is part of the problem in the political theological vortex, is a dehistoricization, a saturation of feeling that some people might call it like love or affect, but it is actually a really punishing kind of Dionysian, to use another Greek myth, but this exhausting thing that comes out of trying to feel all the time. Now, would I suggest that what we need is a kind of return to order? I'm not sure. I think that we probably need to question the ordering principles that we have inherited throughout multiple generations, and this is probably what leads us to talk about, jump from the ancient Greeks to contemporary society in 30 seconds.
Thank you. That's super helpful.
Okay, Jonathan, you had a question.
Thank you, Roger. This was really, really interesting, and I'm gonna, I guess, improvise at best and probably just fumble my way towards some kind of question through this. But something that was striking to me early on in your presentation were the images, and maybe that's because I dial into those. And interestingly, I think in my life teaching art history to students, side-by-side images is kind of a thing. And but it also reminded me of especially I'm thinking of the Pentagon image and the levitation sort of protest, and then January 6th. And I was thinking about that pairing in what Benjamin might call like a dialectical image, like these two images, and to then think about, I was thinking about that in light of what you're saying about myth, I guess, is to build on Robert's point. I understood you to be using that term, as you said, as in part the stories we tell ourselves in order to order and make sense or make legible, say, the moment in which we live. And I guess and I guess, like, again, you're also saying that, like, you're reading US political life today in light of, or trying to decipher, what are the myths about the 60s, more or less true or what have you, but the stories we tell about the 1960s in order then to try to make sense of this moment. So you could go back to that, like, double image as, like, well, what relates these two images? What's different about them? How did we get from one point to the other? But as I think like, one of the dominant myths or stories that is told, I think, both by people who might identify as Democrats or Republicans, is the coming of age. So that the whole stories around the generation that went to Woodstock went to the polls to vote for Reagan. So the question then is sort of like, what I'm kind of interested in is, like, how do you read those two sort of, if you like, those two images, those two moments? And, like, the other thing, I guess, so that's one. And I guess, like, to me, of course, the contrast is just apparent too, in terms of, like, one is enchanted, nonviolent, one is, like, concrete and aggressive and so forth. But then, like, I guess, and this is what I'm fumbling towards, is that for me, at least, watching January 6th unfold live, watching the news, initially what I kind of thought was, and even in the ensuing days, was like, how fantastical all this was. I mean that in the sense of, like, in both images, there's this kind of, you could argue, kind of naive view that, like, the Pentagon and, like, the Capitol are somehow, like, the real centers of power. Like, it is a kind of, in some sense, in that sense, a very archaic way of thinking.
Yeah.
But what's also very different about it, and I guess what I'm interested in was also very, very different, is like there's no political legitimation machine behind the attempt to levitate the Pentagon as there is now behind what happened on January 6th, where the Republican Party stated as an official platform that that was indeed legitimate political discourse. So I just kind of want to hear you kind of like, how do you read, are you reading these images as opposed, as like, or maybe more, I guess I want to hear like how you understand this as part of this larger liberal matrix that you want to read, as it were, both of those images in.
Yeah, I think the crux point for me is when you said the legitimate political machine. I'm not sure. Like, I think that there are ways to think of what happened in the 60s as rather organic, I suppose, in the sense that Benjamin talks about people in the revolution shooting at clocks, right? That there's this impulse that happens, this insurrectionary impulse that nobody decided on beforehand, but everybody sort of like agrees on. Something has risen to the surface. The French, my ex-wife's father was in the French resistance, right? And we talked about this before he died, that there was no sort of central authority. There was just sort of this thing that rose to power. I have I think a broader sense of the political or the machine there as well, and that probably comes from like critical theorists again, like this time Adorno and Horkheimer. So like, Carl brought up something earlier about like the Greeks, and like they claim that Odysseus is the first bourgeois, right, in dialectic of enlightenment. I think that people who uprose that, and I don't mean to I'm not making fun of anyone when I'm saying this, and nor am I agreeing or disagreeing with so I'm not making a political statement here, or at least not intending to, but by using the quote insurrection of the I'm not trying to belittle or say that there isn't anything very meaningful about what happened on January 6th last year, but the affective waves that transfer into the insurrectionary impulse, as the Invisible Committee say, I think that those are present for people on the right wing. That we could vilify them as fascists. We could vilify someone like Donald Trump and the effect that he's had on people. But I think that there is a deeper affective feeling that the people who are broadly, cast as being on the right wing in this country have. There's anger, there's frustration, and I think that it's economic for sure. And I think that economics and politics are very mixed up. I don't have a really clear sense of distinctions between these separate spheres. To go back to Rob's question on discourse, I look at things like discourse. So one of the differences between me and a philosopher, for example, is like a philosopher might be doing this thing called philosophy, but I read theory as discourse, right? Like I read this weird genre of theory that people like in the same way that a 19th century American literature person reads 19th century American literature. There's a kind of genre around that makes me pop from psychology to sociology to philosophy to literature, and I think that that's useful, right? I think that it's useful in the book, at least. I move towards the literary, and I feel like we have lost a sense of the literary, and that it might just be that story and fiction is a better way at getting at these things. But if we only read fiction for its or poetry for its philosophical uses, like Simon does, like Alain Badiou does, they feel like they can wrap it all up by the modern moment or whoever they're interested in. I don't agree with that. I have a more capacious sense of the literary that broadens discourse. And so when I read discourse, I read it and I write it with a kind of poetics in mind that has a very unstable sense of what language does, or a very saturated sense of how language and linguistics works. I might have strayed from your question there, but I think that the moment, yes, there are differences between the levitation of the Pentagon and 2021. At the same time, I think that what is similar about the eras is that that vortex element, because there's leftists, the people like, oh, it wasn't us that broke into the Capitol, it was like the leftists who were trying to make us look back. It was Antifa or something like that. So there's those kinds of narratives going on. What I think is more important to sort of try to take account of is the vortex moment that this is like a deep question, like, is the vortex politically created, or is it dialectically created by some sort of temporal regenerative failure that must be rejuvenated within a political the body politic, like as an organic body politic?
Roger, could I zero in on that for a minute?
Sure.
See, if anybody else wants to contribute to the discussion, but the term insurrection, I'm not talking about January 6th. I'm talking about the use of the term and how it's coded in terms of our current political framework or deep core or discourse. And of course, the word is in the word resurrection. It comes from the Latin word from which we get surge. So technically an insurrection is a kind of influx of something from the outside that changes everything. And you look back at the 60s, and the word insurrection was a good word. And I think up until January 6th, it was a good word in generally. Now it's a bad word, and that's not inconsequential. You go back to American history and talk about the myth of American history. It was founded on an insurrection. That there was no organic imaginary substance that somehow the nation of America was built around. It was built around this kind of critical theoretical challenge to ongoing structures. That's why the writings of Jefferson were so important in the forging of the Bill of Rights, if not the Constitution. That insurrectionary moment, which back in the 60s everybody was studying, there was a book that nobody reads anymore, but it had a tremendous influence on me then, and it is now. Michael Walzer, one of the founders of Dissent magazine. It was called The Revolution of the Saints, and his idea was it was kind of the kind of transcendental, ecstatic, religious moment of the Puritan Revolution. This, you could say, Oliver Cromwell in some ways. We look at as a kind of despot, but he saw himself as doing the will of God. That's where the revolutionary moment comes in, and there was all sorts of alliance of Marxist theorists and kind of critical theorists of religion, say people like Vittorio Lantineri, the Revolution of the Saints. In other words, the very order that we call the liberal order is meant to be constantly turned over, just like fields that lie fallow. Jefferson made that point in one of his famous sayings that the tree of liberty is always refreshed with the blood of martyrs and so forth. If you look at the same discourse that saw what I would call this new expanding sense of the polis in the 60s, and the 60s was very political. Even the psychedelic movement was very political. It was a different kind of politics. It wasn't apolitical. It was just like we want to include everyone in what we might call the cosmopolitanism of the universal collective conscious. That's, I think, the way you might describe it. There was a tendency to kind of rationalize it, particularly by the New Left, who were very much influenced by so-called Marxist humanism, as opposed to the old kind of orthodox Stalinism, but both based on this idea that we're tapping into some kind of deeper energy, this kind of insurgency. Now, when we look at what happened on January 6th, and I'll give you a contrast, that's become a kind of nodal point for our thinking about, the recent era. But there was also an event in the early 70s when Nixon was president, became a nodal point for insurrectionary thinkers. And that's when Nixon and who were essentially the mafia who ran New York City at the time, called in the organized labor, the so-called hard hats, construction workers, to basically beat up and beat down the younger Vietnam protesters. And so the idea of the fascist regime of the hard hats, that is the working class, now is seen to be in line with the old order, and the insurrection is coming when it's actually the working class now that are seen as the insurrection. It's not January 6th, but look what is happening in Canada right now. Well, what does that mean? To me, it's obvious that the new neoliberal cosmopolitan order, what David Brooks 25 years ago called the Bohemian bourgeoisie, is the new ruling class. And that's what I wrote about in our book. So, the kind of myth of an enchanted outsiders, the proletariat who are overtaking the bourgeoisie, the roles are kind of reversed, which you're seeing in the reversal of party politics too. So the issue of insurrection and enchantment and citizenship are not inseparable from each other. Insurrection always means that somehow there is a threat to what we consider the right, just order. And I don't know if anybody wants to kind of look at that. I mean, we might take January 6th as a kind of trope for what's changed in the last 50 years.
Well, does anyone else want to jump on that before? Right? I noticed that in the chat that Jonathan had to leave, but I think, and I'm sorry, I got assigned a myth and literature class this summer, and so I am thinking about myth a lot right now. It's making its way,
which is very helpful, by the way. Keep at it.
But the Dionysian moment, is not a nice moment. It never is for anyone. It's not for Pentheus, the king, for sure. But it's also not for the Bacchae, like the people who've gone into these ecstatic states, into the vortex, into the psychedelic, stratosphere. Like, it's not a fun thing. Just like taking ayahuasca is not a fun experience. It's like it's not really a kind of party drug. And there is information, I think, in that tripping type of experience, and that's probably why we have myths like Dionysus and these figures like Dionysus to help us think about that kind of thing. But for me and my thinking here, and the way that my thinking has changed in the past few years, when we're talking about someone like Jefferson, when we're talking about someone like Marx, these are just Euro-Christian colonizers. Yes, Marxian thought is still Euro-Christian. I know the Jewish background, we could talk about that, but it is the imposition of a Euro-Christian worldview that aligns, and capitalism comes out of that. So capitalism is Euro-Christian for me, and that continues to kind of dominate. And what we need is to the possibility to think that other worlds might be able to exist, or I mean, anthropologists call it, they have this language of possible worlds. The Cthulhu scene, Donna Haraway calls it, what are the deep ways of our myths and our culture coming back. And I'm very much thinking these days about worldview, and with my friend Tink Tinker, we're writing a book, and it's about, you know, what is worldview, not ideology, what is beneath ideology, not religion, what is beneath that. So this is not what Althusser meant by a ideological state apparatus, right, in which he uses the apparatus and says that religion is just a function of this, of the apparatus. I think that the theological aspects, the enchanted aspects, hover even beneath the idea of what an apparatus is. And in much of the philosophers' thought that we're discussing today. And indigenous worldviews are a way to think, but that has to be a discussion of listening to indigenous critical theory, which I have purposely not gone into today, and because then we get into these kinds of problems where it's like, oh, Roger, are you speaking for indigenous people, or what do you know about it, that kind of stuff. And I would say I know some things, but yes, I'm not an indigenous person. But where critical theory is and ought to be today in terms of discourse ought to be looking at people like Leanne Bedesamosake Simpson and books like As We Have Always Done, or As We Have Always Lived, you know, like that when we look at real indigenous thinkers who are describing what they're describing in terms of their communities and the ways that they have done things is not enchanted. It's not enchantment like I've returned to the forest and fairies and here's the enchantments like in A Midsummer Night's Dream or something like that. That is not indigenous culture.
No.
Nor is it the Amazons who are depicted in A Midsummer Night's Dream, right? The wife in A Midsummer Night's Dream is the conquered Amazon queen. No. I think that there are voices and people. It's not a matter of simply including them in that kind of ideologized American university speak. It is a recognition of a limit experience. So rather than the psychedelic expansion, it might be that what we need is a recognition of the limit in order to have a sense of not to allow the other to speak in that Christian agape way that like now I can Pac-Man it, but in a sense to sort of realize the limit that we have, like that there are limitations to the ideas of the infinite that are so so thoroughly saturate Euro-Christian culture, including taking psychedelics and having this kind of ego expansion, ego death experience so that you can come back and start your new business or whatever it is you're going to do.
Yeah, right.
in the ways that psychedelics have become part of the biopolitical establishment of neoliberalism.
Yeah, Ben and Jerry's.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I ask you this question: is it really the whole Dionysian meme, Euro-Christian, in that, or Eurocentric? Obviously, it precedes what we call Christianity. A lot of people think Christianity is just something that came on the scene, and it didn't. It actually didn't. It came from the Near East, but isn't that kind of binary between what Nietzsche called the Apollonian and the Dionysian? Isn't this kind of a kind of eternal neurosis of the West in many respects, and the whole idea of citizenship and enchantment, or have an enchanted citizen? That when you're really talking about what is on the outside, let's talk about because the term indigeneity is fluid too, but what is on the outside of your ideology? And we call that enchanted. That's not what's really going on, right? Speaking of indigenous people, I had a very interesting conversation this morning with a friend of mine who is Native American, who's also very much coming to terms now with the kind of balance in his own identity. And he was saying, essentially, when you talk about the indigenous experience, you're not talking about another ideology. You're not talking about a different way of seeing the world. You're talking about a kind of intimacy that you take for granted. And somebody growing up Native American who was always somehow being pushed or forced to accept this way of looking at things or this way of talking, and finally assimilated, and then had a midlife crisis and realized this is not who I am. I want to go back and explore who I really am, and it's now coming to realize that what we would call that indigenous core. Saying that it's not something that you have to systematize and say, okay, it's the indigenous worldview. It's like, this is the way I see things. In a sense, everything else outside it is ideology. It's a system of thought that is imposed and so forth. So the question is, do we get outside our systems of thought? It's not where the real enchantment begins.
Yeah, I don't. I like the way that you phrase that, because it's like, in this discourse of theory, these little memes or kernels show up, right? And one of the ones that shows up all the time is Francis Fukuyama and the end of history that was claimed at the close of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, and that capitalism had won, and now all we have is this one-dimensional capitalism, and therefore, because we can never see the outside of that matrix that we are now in, no matter what color of pill we take, there's no use for doing ideology theory. There's no use for studying critical theory, because there's no way to get at the outside itself, so I would say discursively that passed a long time ago, and there were people that kept engaging with theory, and particularly they were people who were not included in that discourse to begin with. So feminist thinkers, womanist thinkers, indigenous thinkers. Once the so-called others, the marginalized folks who weren't part of the establishment, start gaining some traction in terms of doing real critical theory work, it's amazing how much the establishment wants to say, like, oh, we can't do critical theory anymore. Like, it's no use to do that. It's only old white men do critical theory, right? And it's like, that's a way of being like, so we never have to read Fanon. We never have to read, but take seriously the post-colonial thinkers. In fact, Gayatri Spivak, the problem with Gayatri Spivak is that she was just a privileged person who is posturing as an actual Indian person, and she ignores her own class situation within Indian caste society or something like that. All of these ways to write thinkers off, like, oh, indigenous people, we don't need to listen to indigenous people because post-colonialism is old hat, right? Well, that's a bunch of shit, because it's colonial about indigenous life. It's like, if anybody has been living in the totality of like capitalism for more than the people who've been dealing with it and being annihilated by it for 500 years. And yet we find all sorts of ways not to be able to listen to them. And then of course there's the identity problems of my first year students now. It's like, I'm a quarter Cherokee, and as my indigenous friends say, it's like, was that like your legs, like the calves, like, because they're still working on these kind of like blood quantum biopolitical metaphors of the state. And so, like, we're always kind of at the end of these conversations looking for places to go. And I'm always charged with like, oh, you're romanticizing indigenous life or something like that, which is just another ideological excuse not to listen, not to read any indigenous scholars, right? My girlfriend listened to a podcast with Leon Cass yesterday. He's a total right winger, anti-abortion. Women have confused themselves by entering into the to broader society, and now they've lost what their true relationship to men ought to be, kind of person. And we were laughing because like he talks articulately, and he was in the New York Times, and these are people like, we've lost our values. We've lost it's the same old conservative 60s. We've lost our values. What was so good about America was the values, the Christian values that the Puritans came with to this continent, and it's just a justification for genocide. Like, that's all that it is an ideology in the strictest sense of like that. And what we're trying to get at in these conversations, I think, is something deeper than ideology, is something like worldview.
Right. Exactly right.
But we can't use worldview like in an offhand kind of way. Or we can't confuse worldview with culture, or just call it Weltanschauung or something like that, or like life world. I think that at least some of the people I'm interested in reading, like for example, Mark Friedland, who's an indigenous and Anishinaabe scholar. He's got wrong book. He's got a book called On Worldview. Where he's gone through the Western traditions, he's gone through Kant, he's gone through Hegel, he's gone through all of this stuff, and yet people don't listen to him anymore. And they're like, oh, you're an Indian? Well, maybe I'll listen to you because you're an Indian. It's like, yeah, he's also an Indian who's like telling you why the Western worldview is wrong.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, in terms of my friend who I was referencing this morning, he made it clear it was the engagement with the critical theoretical critique from within of the kind of ideological worldview that he was forced to be in that led him to realize that there, what he calls the intimacy of indigenous experience, meaning that it's something natural. You can't really make it into an ideology, and so there's this de-ideological process of what critical theory is engaged in. In fact, critical theory is the critique of ideology in many respects, if you want to, trace it back to its Marxist sources.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, listen, we're about out of time here, and so. I want to say thank you, Roger, and thank you, everybody.
Hey,
Good
Roger.
to see you, Roger.
Is your class going to be like based